Welcome to The Exchange. I'm Dan Riley. The Exchange is a streaming internet talk show and podcast of interviews with noteworthy people about their lives, ideas, and current events. This week I sit down with Ivana Zoric, curator of the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, Serbia. During our conversation, Ivana talks about the personal life of Nikola Tesla, the breadth of his various inventions, and the resurgence of his popularity in modern times. Welcome to the show. Today I'm sitting down with Ivana Zoric, the curator at the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, Serbia. Ivana, thank you for taking the time to talk about Nikola Tesla and his life.
Thank you for visiting our museum, and thank you for showing interest in Nikola Tesla.
Thank you. I'd like to start by learning a little bit about Tesla the man, who he was, where he came from. Where was he born, and what was his early childhood like here in Serbia and in Croatia?
Well, Tesla was not born in Serbia. In that time, it was Austrian territory. He was born in little village Smiljan in Lika. It's province of Croatia today. But when Tesla was born, it was Austria. Most people say that he was born in Austro-Hungary, but that's not quite true. Austro-Hungary was founded a few years later. So his country of his origin formally is Austria, and today the house where he was born is in Croatia. But he was a Serb, that's why his museum is here in Belgrade. His father was Orthodox priest, and as a son of a priest, he was expected to become a priest as well, but he was not very interested in that, and somehow he decided to become a scientist.
Was he always interested in science? Did people know from the time he was young that he was a genius?
Well, he showed some interest in his early years. In his childhood, he liked to read very much in the library of his father and his uncles. And also, he usually said that his mother was a very smart woman. Of course, she didn't have any connection with modern life and modern inventions, but he said that she had some small inventions which helped her in the house, and that he got his genius for inventing things from his mother, actually.
And what's the journey for him from being born in that small town in Croatia to ending up in the United States? At what age did he actually come over to the U.S.?
He went to United States when he was 28 years old, and before that he studied for some time first in that part of today's Croatia, and then he went to his studies in Graz and then in Prague, and spent a few years in Europe after that as well. He spent some time in Maribor, it's Slovenia today, and then in Paris and Strasbourg. He worked for Thomas Edison in that time, for Thomas Edison's Continental Company, European branch of Edison's company. And in that time in Strasbourg, he came to an idea to make first induction motors. But he couldn't find anyone who would invest in his ideas. Nobody understood what was his improvement in that field. So, trying to find some investors, he got recommendations from Edison's company and decided to go to the United States. And at first, he also worked for Thomas Edison company, but not for a very long time. And after that, he had his own companies for some time, but production of induction motors didn't start in that period neither. So after that, he met George Westinghouse, and that was the first man who understood his ideas and who wanted to invest in his induction motors. And that was the start of good period for Tesla's new inventions in the United States. He lived in New York, and Westinghouse, the electric company, bought some of his patents. The production of induction motors started, and also they started working with system of production, transmission, and distribution of electrical energy, Tesla's system of transmission, distribution of alternating currents instead of direct current, which was used before, and used by Thomas Edison. So that was so-called war of currents between so-called AC/DC war, because between two different concepts, Edison's DC and Tesla's AC.
And I want to unpack some of those different inventions. And the first one is the induction motor. Take me back to the time where he is working on the induction motor and what that improvement in technology would mean for, was it for transportation? Was it for just general improvement of life? What would the induction motor actually be able to do and change in someone's life?
Well, it's changed many things. People usually understand it much better if we say that we use induction motors today in our hair dryers, in our washing machines, in industry as well. So induction motors are all around us. What was new in Tesla's induction motors was that he used a magnetic field. There is a static part of induction motor, which is called stator, and rotating part. And there is no direct contact between them, no brushes, no less durable parts of the motor. The rotor is moved just thanks to magnetic field, which is inducted in the motor. That was what is new in Tesla's induction motor at the end of 80s in 19th century.
And that induction motor just allowed for greater amounts of energy to be created, or what was before the induction motor, what was the leading technology of the time that was trying to do the same thing that the induction motor did?
They had a little bit different motors with some kind of brushes.
Okay.
And now we mostly use in our houses and in the industry, as I said, we use Tesla's induction motors. And also for his induction motors, he used polyphase alternating currents, which was also his invention.
You mentioned the name Thomas Edison, and almost every American knows the name Thomas Edison, and probably up until the last 10 years, almost no one knew the name Nikola Tesla. As I understand it, they had a rivalry that went throughout their entire life, and from the book that I read about Nikola Tesla, it seemed like Edison was the well-financed member of the two, smart man, but was sort of looking for Nikola Tesla to create inventions that he could then go capitalize on monetarily. Talk about their relationship, the differences between the two men, the similarities between the two men, and what ended up happening with the two of them.
Well, Thomas Edison was inventor, but he was also, as you said, well-financed, and he was, we can say, industrial or something like that. And Tesla was, in that time, less famous, and he didn't have financial resources. He wasn't very interested in finances. He needed money just for his projects. He didn't want to get rich or something like that. His most important idea was to present something new to the humankind, and that's probably the difference between those two personalities. And since Thomas Edison already had his empire built on DC, Tesla was a big rival, of course. That's why they had that big war of currents. In some period, Edison even used Tesla's AC to kill some animals in public places just to show that Tesla's electricity is dangerous. He wanted just to preserve his position in the field of production of electricity. What was the problem with Edison's DC is that you couldn't transmit it to long distances. You can transmit DC just a few kilometers away from the power plant, or if you would want to transmit it to long distances, you would have too much loss of energy. And in Tesla's concept, you can have huge power plant in one position and then transmit energy to very long distances with less loss of energy, and that's what we do today, just like in Tesla's time. That's probably one of the main reasons that Tesla succeeded to win in that war of currents. The big win in that war was first Chicago Fair in 1893. Tesla and George Westinghouse got the job to do all the lightings in big world fair in Chicago, and about 27 million people visited that fair. they saw Tesla's inventions, and they saw so-called City of Light in that time. That was the first step in Tesla's victory over Edison. And after that, just 3 years later, in 1896, Niagara Falls power plant started working, and 9 out of 13 patents which were used for Niagara Falls power plant were Tesla's, which actually shows his big contribution at that important point in the history of electrical energy. That was first big power plant which used Tesla's system of production of electrical energy, and that was just a start. For example, in our country, in Serbia, just 4 years after Niagara Falls, we got first small but first power plant which used Tesla's system. And that's how it went in the rest of the world as well. And till today, nothing has changed. Actually, the system is the same. A little technology improvements, maybe in some transformers, but the process, the principle is still the same. How we produce energy, how we transmit it to long distances, and how we use it in our houses or in the industry and factories.
And in that relationship with Edison, it seems like initially Edison saw the genius of Nikola Tesla and believed that he could capitalize on his inventions for his company. Was there a point at which Nikola Tesla finally realized that he was maybe the pawn in the chess game and that he was being used by Edison to make him money? And how did Nikola Tesla sort of grow up and realize that, you kind of need money in order to make inventions actually work? And how did that change him as a man?
Well, I'm not sure that it changed him. I think that he was well aware that his idea is a major improvement, and he worked for Thomas Edison just for a short period of time as an engineer in his companies, but pretty soon he realized that he couldn't do what he needed to do with the motors and electricity working for Thomas Edison. So just like I said, he quit that job.
And it sounds like with George Westinghouse, there was a better relationship between the two of them. As I understand it, the Westinghouse company was based in Pittsburgh at that time. And what was the relationship like with Westinghouse? Did Westinghouse sort of appreciate the genius of Tesla and let him have the resources he needed to invent and create? Or what was the dynamic between the two of them?
Well, I understand that George Westinghouse just understood Tesla's ideas, and of course, probably he had an idea how to earn money from that, and he bought Tesla's patents, some of them, and that's how he went producing induction motors and started the project on Niagara Falls. And at some point, they had some agreement, written agreement, that Tesla would earn $1 out of every horsepower produced. When they started producing large amounts of energy, Westinghouse realized that Tesla will get really rich and that his company won't be in well position if he would pay all that money to Nikola Tesla. And when they discussed that to him, Tesla just teared up the agreement and said that the money is not most important for him. So that is a good example of his idea of money and earning money. He just needed money for new projects and not for himself.
And I know, as I understand it, when he died, Nikola Tesla was not a wealthy man. That he went through, there was maybe times in his life where he had certainly more money than the average American would have, but it wasn't like one of these technology tycoons of today where he starts a foundation, he starts a company, everybody in the world knows who he is. What's the path from the genius of Nikola Tesla creating all these technologies, having all these patents, to then dying in New York City in 1943, not penniless, as I understand it, but really not rich?
No, he was never really rich. He was not interested in that, as I said, but all his life in New York, he spent in hotels in Manhattan. in really nice hotels, so he wasn't poor. And he had really nice clothes, as we can see from what we have here at the museum today, from his legacy. And so he spent some money on himself, definitely. But when he was quite old, he didn't have much money, that's for sure. He got some money from Yugoslavia at that period, from the government from here. But as I said, he still lived in hotels, nice hotels in Manhattan, so he wasn't really penniless. He never had family, so he didn't have to earn money for his family either. So that's probably one of the reasons he was dedicated just to science. That's why he never wanted to have his own house and his wife or children, because he would have the same. He thought that he would have to share the passion that he had for science, to share it with some people around him, and he wanted to focus just on science.
There was an article I read, I think last year, about Larry Page, the CEO of Google. And when Larry Page was a young person, I think he was a teenager, he read a book about Nikola Tesla. And when he did that and got to the end of the book and learned about how, I think Tesla had sort of been crushed by some capitalists. And like you said, he wasn't a poor man, but he didn't die revered by the world and by the United States. And as the story said in the article, Larry Page was crying at the end of the book. And this is long before he created Google. But I think the story of Tesla made him mindful of the fact that people can use brilliant people for ends if you aren't careful about it. And that obviously is not the case with Larry Page. I mean, he's one of the most famous CEOs in the world. Going back to this museum, and downstairs there is a notation about Marconi and Nikola Tesla and the invention of the first radio, or the distribution of the radio. And in 1943, as I understand it, after he died, the Supreme Court of the United States basically created a verdict, or had a verdict, saying that Nikola Tesla actually was the first inventor of the radio. Even though Tesla is now more well known because of the cars, because of the popularity of everything that he's done. Do you feel like most people understand that about Tesla? And what did he do to create the radio? What's the story of how he was able to actually do that?
The end of 19th century was a period of big breakthroughs in different fields of engineering. So it wasn't just Tesla or just Marconi, but many other scientists worked in the same field and came to some conclusions or results in the same way or in different ways. So sometimes it's not very easy to judge who was the first, or who was right, or who used somebody else's ideas to make something new. So basically what American Supreme Court judged, they said that Marconi just used some Tesla's patents and some patents of other scientists, Stone and Bloch, and that he made just a combination of those previous patents, not making anything new, but just a combination of something that already was invented. So that's why Tesla got the patent of radio officially, but mostly in some books related to history of technology, or in encyclopedias or other books, mostly they say that Marconi is inventor of radio. Why wasn't that changed? Actually, I'm not sure. But what we can say is that Tesla was the first one in that field. But what he also worked on, for example, X-rays. He made beautiful pictures of his leg and a hand, and actually we don't know if it was his or somebody else's head or hand, but he made nice X-ray photographies in the same period when Röntgen was doing it. Who was the first one? Maybe it was Tesla, but he was not interested in patenting that. It was just some maybe side effect of some of his experiments. So, as I said, sometimes it's really not easy to decide who was the first one in that really dynamic period in science.
There's a section of the museum downstairs that's dedicated to his time in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Why did he go out there, and what are the main things that he worked on and was able to discover out west in the U.S.?
Well, he had laboratories in New York before that, but probably New York was too overcrowded for that kind of experiments. So he decided to go to some place where there is less people and buildings to make laboratory on some little hill with nothing around him. And he made huge transformer, today known as Tesla coil, which had voltage of 12 million volts and really high frequencies as well. It was loud, and he needed to be alone to do the experiments, of course with some helpers. And that's how he made those great photographies. Probably most people have seen them. Tesla sitting and reading the book, and with all those sparks and discharges around him. And what we can say about that photo is that was done with double exposure, actually some kind of Photoshop of that time. First they made a photo of Tesla sitting, and then on the same negative they made a photo of the machine working with all those sparks.
Pretty clever.
Yes, pretty clever, but he admitted that it was double exposure. So he started working with high frequencies and high voltages in that period, and then he continued in his new laboratory in Long Island.
I want to talk about Tesla the man, and I know from the physical descriptions I know of Tesla, he reminds me in body type of like Jimmy Stewart. Very tall, very thin, could never put on weight. I think he was something like 6'2", almost 2 meters tall, 140, 150 pounds in total. If Nikola Tesla walked in the room today, who would he look like? What did he look like?
Well, he was tall for that time, not 2 meters, maybe 1.86 or 7 as we can calculate, and his weight was the same almost all his life. He could never put on some weight, just like you said. In some periods he was taking care of his what he eats and what he drinks. That's what we know from some documents. And living in hotels, we know what he ate for his breakfast because we have some bills and some papers about it. But he was taking care of his health, yeah. And he was really, really thin and tall and had mustaches all the time.
Outside of his physical, you were mentioning how well dressed he was, that he always was dressed up in a suit and looked very sharp. It seemed like even though he worked so much of his life on inventions, people still knew him in the upper crest of the New York social life, that he was very good dinner company. As you also mentioned, a lifelong bachelor, never was married, never has any kids. Did he have girlfriends? Was he not interested in relationships with women? What is the story about his personal life in that regard?
Well, some people think that he was a lonely man. He spent all his life in laboratories. That's not quite true. He had some friends. He went to some dinners, to theater, and really to the houses of his friends and spending some time with them and their families. We don't know about any relationship with any woman. Here at the museum we have a large archive with a lot of letters from some women, but it looks like they were all his friends. Mm-hmm. Some of them married, some of them not. For example, Katherine Johnson, who was wife of his really good friend Robert Underwood Johnson, she wrote hundreds of letters to him, and it looks they were really close friends, but it looks like there is nothing much more in that story. Also, for example, a woman called May Klein was writing him letters for, 30 years, for example. We don't have his letters written to her, probably probably he wrote to her because, but we don't know for sure because she wasn't famous enough for someone to preserve those letters. But we don't have any proof of any kind of relationship, romantic relationship with any woman in the United States or anywhere else.
You mentioned at the beginning of the interview that his father was a priest, and his father was interested in him potentially becoming a priest, and he never did. From what I've read about Tesla, he was not very religious, or really not quite religious at all. He was interested in some of the philosophical ideas of Buddhism, as I understand it. Speak to what his religious beliefs were, if there were any. What did he believe? Did he believe in a personal God? Was he religious in any way?
We don't know much about his religious views. Just like you said, we can read that he was studying some other religions, but we don't know for sure if he was really believing in any God or any religion.
And he died in 1943, so before the end of the Second World War, but he lived through the First World War. He came to the United States, which makes me think he probably believed in democracy, or he certainly seemed to have some humanistic tendencies, that he was interested in improving humanity through technology. What were his political persuasions? Did he ever write on that? Do we know what his leanings were in terms of his political beliefs?
Well, he was not very interested in politics, but he had some interviews during the war, but mainly not political, but also connected to some impact of new technologies on the war that was in progress. So not mainly political. The other scientists from this part of the world, Mikhailo Pupin, had some political connections in the United States and also with Serbian people over there, and having some public talks about some of his political views, but not us.
The last subject I want to go over is the resurgence of the name Nikola Tesla in the world, and how he's become much more popular over the last 5 or 10 years. I would imagine a lot of that must have to do with the popularity of the new luxurious electric car company, Tesla Motors, created by Elon Musk. Is that the primary reason why people are talking about Tesla more now than they used to be? And if not, what are the reasons for Nikola Tesla becoming more famous in the world today?
Well, I think that there are a lot of reasons. Of course, Tesla electric car is just one of them. Maybe in the United States, but not that much in the rest of the world. But he's becoming popular in most countries today. For example, in our country, Serbia, we have him on 100 dinars bill. We have his monuments around the city. We have Nikola Tesla Airport in Belgrade. We have him in our school programs. So from the small kids, everybody knows what Tesla invented. But in the rest of the world, it wasn't the case in past years. But in the last maybe 10 years or so, people are just discovering him. Maybe one of the reasons was that his patents are actually still alive. Some of the patents of other scientists from 19th or the beginning of 20th century were overcame by new technologies, and some new discoveries made them a part of history. And as I said, Tesla's induction motor is still used in the same shape and with the same principles. Tesla's alternating currents are all around us. Also, production is the same as 100 years ago. It wasn't overcame by new technologies. Also, what is actually becoming more and more popular in past years are different wireless technologies. And Tesla was also a pioneer in that field, and that is maybe the most important thing in this period. For example, Tesla was, we didn't mention that, the pioneer of remote control, and he experimented with different kinds of wireless transmission of messages, transmission of energy. He wanted to transmit not just voice, not just energy, but also different kinds of messages all around the world. That was his idea of his world system of transmission. And at the very beginning of 20th century, he actually predicted something that in today's language would be GPS, GPRS, internet, different systems. Maybe he didn't have idea how to do that in that period and with technology of that time, but he actually predicted development of technologies which are part of our everyday life, but at the beginning of 21st century. So maybe that is what made him that famous in these years.
The things that Tesla has his fingerprints on, like you mentioned, wireless technology,
Yes.
engines that are running almost everything that we use or many things that we use, general distribution of electricity. Is he the greatest inventor of all time? I mean, that's a subjective question, but is that the case? Do people, in your judgment, is he the greatest inventor that humanity has ever produced?
Maybe he is. Well, I would be really subjective to say that since I work in his museum, but yes, I think that some of his most important inventions really changed the path of humankind in the 20th century, and maybe many things would be different if Tesla didn't do what he did.
The last question I want to ask you is about the difference between genius and hard work. He clearly worked hard. As you mentioned, he dedicated so much of his life, no family. He had social engagements, but a lot of his time was spent working on his inventions. But it also seems like, from what I've read, that a lot of the inventions that almost came to him sort of in like a dreamlike state, that he'd be walking around or he'd be sleeping and all of a sudden there would be this solution that would come over him. How do you see what he was able to accomplish in their life? It doesn't seem like most people in this world have the capacity to create the sort of things that a man like Nikola Tesla was able to create. Was it a combination of genius and hard work? Was it mostly an incredible genius with an incredible drive? How do you see how he was able to make everything that he did in one lifetime?
Yes, he really did a lot of things in his lifetime. Even in his younger years, he did the most important things. So, I suppose that was mostly the genius, as you said, but also hardworking. And today you would have a whole team of scientists, a lot of machines, a lot of brainstormings, a lot of people thinking about it, and he was working alone and making all that stuff in 19th century with the tools that he had in that time. So, and as you said, he said in his autobiography that his ideas came to his mind like a dream, or like some kind of imagination, and that he could make machine in his head and even make improvements in his head before actually he started working on actually making physical machine. So that was probably a great imagination, great genius, and of course a lot of hard work.
Ivana, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking about Nikola Tesla today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're interested in learning more about The Exchange, want to listen to episodes online, or would like to reach out to the show, feel free to visit the show's website at theexchangeshow.com.